Artlist.io.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another live episode of My True Crime Obsession. And tonight, we're again going to be talking about the Rex Heuermann Long Island serial killer case. It's been just over a year since Rex Heuermann's arrest in Gilgo Beach, the List case. He was arrested last year on Thursday, July 13th, 2023. And now it's a year later. And tonight I'm going to be looking back on this ever-evolving case and over the last year and discussing all the developments that have taken place since his arrest last year. Tonight I have special guest TV news journalist Mary Murphy joining me in the studio this evening to discuss the case, provide some information, some background information, in developments that are going on in the case, and answer some of my questions. I have so many questions I want to ask her. And if you're not familiar with who Mary Murphy is, she is a veteran news journal with over 40 years experience in journalism. She has worked with WPIX-11 in New York City and also CBS News New York. She has earned 32 Emmy Awards for her work. And she specializes in true crime stories. And she's covered stories like the mob hit ordered by John Gotti on Paul Castellano outside the Spark Steakhouse in December of 1986. She also covered the New York City truck bombing that took place on the World Trade Center in 1993. Those are just two of many stories that she's covered. But over the past year, Mary Murphy has extensively covered the Rex Heuermann Long Island serial killer case. And I've had the honor of being in Mary's presence during her news coverage on this ongoing case and news story, both in Massapequa Park, and I was also with her near her at Rex Heuermann's home, but I was also at Suffolk County Courthouse in Riverhead when he was arraigned last year on Friday, July 14th, 2003. So I want to thank you, Mary Murphy, for joining me today. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you and have you as a guest on my podcast and help you share your wealth of knowledge with regards to this case. I have so many questions I'd love to ask you, but first and foremost, what was it that drew you to this case? I mean, when did you really start getting into coverage of this case?
Well, I was home watching the 10 o'clock news in 2010, in mid-December of 2010, when the first victims were found on Gilgo Beach. The first woman found was Melissa Barthelemy, and then a couple of days later, we found the other three that make up the Gilgo Four: Amber Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Megan Waterman. And initially, we had some of the night reporters covering these developments. And then a few months later, when there was a thaw in the spring, more victims were found, 6 other sets of remains. When I really got into the case was actually when the first articles of clothing tied to Shannan Gilbert were discovered. And that was nearly a year later. And that was in Oak Beach in the marsh where they found her cell phone, they found her clothing, they found a bag. And I was out there when the police commissioner, Richard Dormer at the time, and the original chief of detectives on the case, Dominic Verone, they had a command center there right near that Oak Beach Association. And I met Gus Coletti. He was a figure from this, a witness, an early witness when Shannan Gilbert disappeared May 1st, 2010. And people were telling me how the marsh was really mucky and, you could really sink easily. And so, they weren't surprised that was sort of a chamber of death for Shannan Gilbert. And of course, to this day, nearly 14 years later, there are people who say that she was a victim of foul play, that she was murdered, although several different police administrations in Suffolk County have said that it was a tragic accident, that she ran, she was afraid of something. She maybe was having some kind of a psychiatric reaction to something and ran off into the night. I mean, there are a lot of different theories as to what happened to her, but so far the police are saying it was a tragic accident.
Yes, yeah, and I've spoken with people close to Suffolk County Police Department, and yes, I've heard that account. I've heard that narrative that they put out. I mean, for me personally, there's a lot of information about the Shannan Gilbert case that makes me think that maybe it wasn't an accident. I mean, I understand Suffolk County Police Department is standing by their investigation, and it's been under several people have taken over in Suffolk County, and they've had different people in office now. And like you said, yes, with each new administration, they all admit that, or stick to the story that it was an accident. What are your thoughts on that? Do you believe that?
What's interesting is I've spoken to several different investigators over the years, and they all stayed pretty consistent when it came to Shannan Gilbert. And some of them were not entrenched in Suffolk County politics, so it's not like they were protecting someone.
Mm-hmm.
And what these investigators have consistently told me, including the former police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, who came from the NYPD, they consistently said that they don't think she was one of the murder victims. And when you think of the guy that hired her, who lived on Oak Beach, and you could hear him a little bit in the 911 call, what I'm told now is that, the following morning, he called 911 to say something crazy happened in my house last night. He didn't attempt to whitewash anything, although, the media descended on his home, and some of the attorneys representing the families, drew him into depositions. But he was never charged with anything. He was the guy that hired Shannan Gilbert, but he didn't use a burner phone.
Yes, Joseph Brewer.
Phone.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I didn't know if I should say his name.
Okay, I mean, it's public knowledge, so.
He didn't use a burner phone. He didn't hide who it was that was calling.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, whatever happened in that house, Shannan Gilbert got upset. Supposedly Joe Brewer asked her to leave. Michael Pack, her driver, he was outside. She said, "They're trying to kill me." He told her to get in the car. All the accounts that I've heard from the different police administrations after Spoda, after James Burke, the accounts that I've heard is that they don't think that Shannan was a Gilgo victim.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people don't accept that, and I understand why. Because, she was found in an area so close to the other victims.
Sure. I don't believe that she is a go-go victim either, but I'm not necessarily sure that, she died by natural causes by running into the marsh area. But, I mean, it is what it is. I hate to say that, but, I don't want to simplify it, but unfortunately, it's a situation where that is what Suffolk County has determined, and that's the way it's going to remain until the case gets reinvestigated, which I don't think that there will be a chance that case will be reinvestigated. But I think it's hard not to bring up that case because obviously it was Mary Gilbert who pushed looking for her daughter in Oak Beach, and if it wasn't for her perseverance and fortitude, I don't know that any of these other victims would have been found along the Ocean Parkway. So it's difficult not to talk about it without talking about Shannan's case. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You have to speak about Shannan when you speak about Gilgo, because there's no denying that if she had not disappeared and if her mother and other family members had not pushed for a search, these other victims may never have been found. And, first we had 4 victims very close together.
Yes.
And we had 6 more spread all along Ocean Parkway, east to west. What stands out to me is, positioning. The Asian male, John Doe, he was found closest to the Gilgo Four. And he was intact. I mean, his skull was bashed in.
Yes.
He suffered blunt force trauma, but he was found very close to the Gilgo Four. So that kind of says something to me that he could be attached, especially when you look at the search history of Rex Heuermann and search for an Asian person. It was a slang word referring to a slim Asian man. And this victim kind of fit that profile. It seemed like he was a slight, not very tall Asian man. So, you look at that, the search. It's interesting to note that Peaches was on one end of Ocean Parkway on the Nassau County side, yet the female toddler tied to her through DNA was found at the other end, much closer to Gilgo victim Valerie Mack.
Yes.
Valerie Mack, was initially found her torso in Manorville, about 40 miles to the east in 2000. And then some other body parts were found in 2011 during the Gilgo search. And it was a similar situation for Jessica Taylor.
Yes, I was just going to say that.
2003 in Manorville. And her other body parts were found also near Ocean Parkway. And when that planning document came out on June 6th this year, even though Rex Heuermann was not charged with killing Valerie Mack at this point, there were many references to her case when the planning document was brought up and how bodies were to be dismembered, hands and heads removed. So there were many references to Valerie Mack, and he is a person of interest in her murder.
Yes. Let me ask you about that, because from what I've been following with news reports and everything online, I understand, and I could be wrong, but I understand that that's imminent, that he may in fact at some point down the road in the future, the near future, may be charged with her murder. Would you concur with that? Would you speculate at this point?
I can't speculate. It would not be a surprise to me at all.
Yes. Okay.
Because in some ways, it's very similar to what we had happening last July, when 3 of the Gilgo Four were tied to Rex Heuermann, the date of his arrest. But then the 4th, he was considered the prime person of interest, the prime suspect. But we had to wait like another 6 months before he was indicted in Maureen Brainerd Barnes's case. And so we kind of have a similar situation here. Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack's remains were treated brutally, very much the same. They both had their arms cut beneath the elbows, and they were tied in similar fashion and found very close to each other, near Halsey Manor Road out in Manorville, the woods. So it would not be a surprise to most of us who have covered this case extensively if he gets charged. But you need to have either science behind it or some really good witness. So, I guess they had the stronger science in Jessica's case in June, because there was a hair found on the surgical tarp that was beneath her body in the woods.
Yes.
So we don't know what they have in terms of Valerie Mack, but she was mentioned several times in reference to the latest indictment and in reference to the planning document.
So, yes, let me ask you about that. I mean, I know that a lot of, God bless the Suffolk County, Gilgo Beach Task Force and Ray Tierney, the work that they're doing. I mean, just so commendable. And they have so much to go through. I mean, my understanding is when that bail document came out, when he was in court on June 6th, there was a ton of information in there about how many technological devices he had, burner phones, laptops, so many different things. And now the task force and Ray Tierney need to go through all of that evidence. And do you feel that a lot of, these future murders that he may be tied to are being delayed because the task force has to go through all this technology and has to go through all the DNA evidence? Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. I do know that the information relating to the planning document was discovered in March of this year. So it was another 3 months before he was indicted for Jessica Taylor's murder. And the planning document, I guess, assisted them a little bit with the Sandra Castilla case as well, because there was a lot of reference to torture and using instruments for sexual substitution. Sandra Castilla was found, quite a bit away from the two victims in Manorville that we've spoken so much about.
Yeah, she was found in North Haven, correct? In Southampton?
It's in Southampton, North Sea.
North Sea, pardon me, North Sea, yes.
Yeah, but that was the big surprise because her name was attached so much to John Bittroff.
Yes.
I covered John Bittroff's arrest, which was back in July of 2014. So that's 10 years ago. And, the whole thing with the press conference, Tom Spota was the DA at that time. He had the press conference. They were heralding genetic genealogy, or the familial genealogy, I should say, the familial DNA, because his brother got into trouble, John Bittroff's brother, and so his DNA was in the state database. So when they did one of those routine checks with unsolved cases, there was a close match between John Bittroff's brother and the DNA left at the crime scene of some of these women. So then they got John Bittroff's DNA, and it matched some of the victims from these early 90s murders out in, well, two of them were near Manorville, Shirley, Patchogue. So, but they never indicted John Bittroff for Sandra Castilla. And I was a little surprised because what we kept hearing over and over was that these three women that died a month apart, Rita Tangretti was found in November of 1993, Sandra Castilla in December of 1993, and then Colleen McNamee in January of 94, the new year. So a month apart for each victim, and they're all talked about and supposedly tied potentially to John Bittroff. But then when it came time to indict him for the murders, they only indicted him for the first murder and the third murder that were spoken of, and never indicted him for Sandra Castilla. And what we are learning now is that there was no semen, there was no seminal fluid found at the crime scene of Sandra Castilla. There was semen found in Rita Tangretti's case and also Colleen McNamee. Part of the problem was there were other donors, potentially. These women had done some sex work. And so there possibly were other men that, their DNA was on their bodies. But the prosecutors successfully argued at trial in Bittroff's case, that he was the most recent person to have been involved with them sexually. And, he's still appealing. And there are some people that think he got railroaded. But for the people who want to think that Rex did all three of these women, Ray Tierney said the crime scenes are very, very different.
Yes.
Sandra Castilla had no DNA in the sexual part of her body. And in fact, there was evidence of torture with a sharp instrument, about 25 marks on her body. Mm-hmm. She was mutilated.
Yes.
Whereas the other two women were killed with blunt force, and there was evidence of sexual contact. So very different crime scenes, yes. Even though for years I was among the people who thought the three crime scenes were very similar, because we heard they were all positioned in a similar way. Their arms were over their heads. But as someone pointed out to me recently, they could have been dragged to the crime scenes.
Okay,
and could have been over their heads from being dragged. The Colleen and Rita, their legs were kind of positioned in an extreme way. I don't want to go into detail, but it was very extreme. And it was not the same with Sandra Castilla. Her legs were under her body.
Yes, yes.
So there were differences between the other two and Sandra Castilla.
Yes, but as you said, it was very surprising. And one of the things that I found is you have to look at, I believe she was found in November of 1993, Sandra Castilla, November 20th, I think it was.
No. The first one was Rita Tangretti in November.
Okay.
Sandra was in the middle of those three victims.
But we're going back now to 1993. I mean,
which means that they're saying the prosecutors saying he's been killing for more than 30 years,
And
according
that's
to the
a
indictment.
very frightening thought. I mean, and there could be victims possibly before even 1993. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, if I don't know how much you want to speculate on that.
Well, serial killers don't usually start in their early 40s, which is how old I think Rex Heuermann would have been when the Gilgo Four were found. He would
Yes.
have been around 40 or a little over 40. Now, 31 years ago, what would he be in his late 20s or something like that? And that's the Sandra Castilla case. Um, I tend to think there's a lot of depravity here just based on what we're reading about in the searches and in the computer documents. I would not be surprised if there are a lot more victims. But as someone pointed out to me, 6 victims, that's a lot of victims. So I don't know if it's
Yeah,
going to
just
stop there. But I just think because he searched for that slang term involving a slim Asian male, I just feel like there were other male victims. That's just my sense, and I don't have any proof of it. Only the geography of where these other John Does were found.
And correct
Not
me if I'm wrong, in that document and all his searches on the web, there was a lot of trans Asian, and I believe that this victim, John Doe number 9, I believe it is, the Asian male Doe, that he was also trans, correct?
well, he was dressed in women's clothing.
Yes. Okay.
There's hardly anything known about him. We don't know if family ever searched for him, and he was young. According to what the police said, when the Gilgo News website was still up, he was anywhere from 17 years old to 23. That's young.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I obviously has not been tied to that murder yet, but it's interesting to make the similarities and look at the MO and look at the similarities and see if there is a connection there. Let's just talk a little bit about, you were in front of Rex's house. I know you were there last year when he was arrested, and you were in Massapequa Park, and I know you were also in Riverhead County Courthouse. Let me ask you, I know you've done coverage in front of Rex Heuermann's house. Talk to the audience a little bit about his house. I mean, I've been down that block. I was there. I saw how beautiful. I mean, when you think people who are unfamiliar with Long Island and particularly Massapequa Park, it's a very, very beautiful area on the south shore of Long Island. And, I call it it's not really upper class, but it's middle to upper class people that live there. A lot of families, working families, people who work in, a lot of people that work in civil servants. But the one thing that, comes to mind is that how well kept the neighborhood is, how
all
these
the
people
lawns are
manicured their
manicured.
lawns.
Yes.
And you drive down that road, one house after the other is so beautiful, and then you come to this eyesore. I mean, just if you want to speak a little bit about that, I mean, my take on it is, my goodness, like, how did the neighbors, feel about living next to this person, and then all this information comes out about him?
Well, I mean, the media descended on First Avenue in Massapequa Park.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, in the morning when we first learned of the arrest on July 14th, the law enforcement, so many of them, the investigators, the guys in the white Tyvek suits, they were all outside his house. The big trucks were there. There were drones going. We were capturing all that initial search that was going on. And in the effort to get the best information we could, I was lucky to confirm early that there was a white male in his late 50s in custody. And I did a cell phone call to our news studio for the 8 o'clock hour. It was obviously the lead story. But initially, we were under the assumption that he was arrested in his house, and that was not the case.
That's
He was
right.
arrested the night before, and no one knew about it. There were several investigators who surrounded him as he left work on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and he did not resist arrest. From what we understand, the police actually recorded the arrest, and he was brought immediately out to Suffolk County Police Headquarters in Yaphank. And that morning of July 14th, I found out he was going to be in Riverhead appearing for the indictment to be unsealed. So my boss said, you have to get out to Riverhead.
Yes.
We had another crew that was already at the house in Massapequa Park. But for me, as the lead reporter who had to get the best information, that was going to come in Riverhead, because
Yes.
that's the indictment would be presented. Never expected to get a bail affidavit of 32 pages that would list so much of the evidence. I've had situations where there was evidence listed in a document, in companionship with an indictment. Never had this much detail in a case like this. It was astounding what we
Yes.
learned, even in that first affidavit that came out of the DA's office.
Yes.
That's what we found out about all the burner phones that he bought, allegedly. There were at least 7 burner phones, and the burner phones, we used a different phone for each murder. We had the pictures of him making the fake Tinder site with a selfie. There were the pictures of him in one of those mobile phone stores trying to buy more minutes for the burner phones. There were sketches that showed the boxes of where the cell phone pings were within areas of Manhattan where he worked, and then, of course, in Massapequa Park. So we were getting an astounding, remarkable number of details.
So let me
early on.
ask you about that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but so to get a grand jury indictment, you just need enough evidence to prove that you need to further continue this and then charge them with murder. I mean, just enough. You don't want to give away too much, because obviously it's an active, ongoing case, and it's going to at some point go to trial. But I mean, you said you were astounded by all this information, so I'm just thinking to myself, did they give too much information in that affidavit, you feel? Or maybe it was just, that there's how much more information do they have? I mean, there must be a wealth of information then.
Well, I'm getting the sense that they had a lot more information and did not share it.
Yes.
But one thing also to remember is that they had the mitochondrial DNA, but they really wanted to get the swab from his mouth to try to get nuclear DNA to sort of give a definitive answer as to, yes, this really is his DNA that we found at least one crime scene, Megan Waterman's crime scene.
Yes.
Then, of course, there were female hairs tied to relatives in his household. Initially, we just found out about 3 hairs relating to his wife, Asa Ellerup. And then later on, much later on, I guess it was in January when the 4th indictment was announced, then we find out that one of the female hairs from the household was connected to his daughter, and that was found on, I believe, the belt buckle. No, it was found on Amber Costello. Mm-hmm. So, but the DA consistently has told the media and has reinforced his belief that the family was always away when these crimes happened, when he had enough time to spend time allegedly torturing these victims and finding ways to get rid of them. And there's a strong belief that the women were killed in his home. And while that was not stated outright, that's why when they had the second search in the spring year, they went into the basement specifically, and they were taking out wood paneling, probably pieces of the ceiling, because they want to know how these women could have been maybe suspended in the basement. I mean,
and I believe there was something in the bail application that talked about his, for lack of a better term, he had this manifesto where he not only killed, but he documented how he failed in certain aspects and then tried to improve upon that. And I think it's something with the tacks and the ceiling that weren't working. So you need to go back.
One thing that stayed with me was when he made reference to getting better rope.
Yes.
Because the last time it broke.
Ugh.
That suggested there was another victim before 2002, because, he tried to get rid of this document, this planning document. He had tried to erase it from the computer, and it was in unallocated space. And these are terms that I never really knew about. I mean,
so can you tell me a little bit about what that means, unallocated space?
For someone who's not tech savvy, I've had to learn a lot and do my best to explain to people. But apparently, if you try to remove a document or erase it, sometimes it can go to unallocated space, and you might think it's erased, but a forensic expert can extract it. So he might have thought it was erased, but it was really still in there. And so it was extracted.
Yes.
And so that's kind of what happened. And even though it said 2002 when they found the document, they believe there was an earlier version of it in 2000, and that's the year that Valerie Mack was killed.
Okay. Well,
That in and of itself doesn't
Yes.
say that he did it, but it was
it's, yeah, overwhelming though. I
and,
mean,
and also, like, just the references to the pre-prep, like he had to do reconnaissance journeys.
I mean, I have the document here
Right.
with me. I've gone through this document. I can't tell you how
I've
many
gone through it
times.
several times,
Yes.
but I'm not looking at it right now.
Yeah,
but I
no.
pretty
But
well.
yes, he had something with prep, and then I believe afterwards it was, yes, he made reference to what to do afterwards. So yes, I have it here in the
So
document.
he was trying to find areas where there would be limited surveillance cameras.
A post-event, yes, yeah. I mean,
But
I mean,
that was the planning.
even talking about security cameras on all the major roadways on Long Island. I'm sitting here reading this, and I was just like, wow. I mean, you talk about his attention to details. It's horrifying. How much prep went into this, and just. So, I mean, but he thought he was so smart, but he did make mistakes, obviously.
Yeah, well, what I find remarkable, I asked the district attorney about it when I spoke to him last week. Aside from the cell phone data and the communications with the women that he tried to erase, the fact that female hair played such a role in attaching him to most of these murders, I think is quite remarkable, because only one of his hairs was found among the Gilgo Four.
And who was that? Which remains was that?
That was Megan Waterman.
Okay.
So the Gilgo Four, one of his hairs was found on Megan Waterman, allegedly. But the female hairs from his household, from his wife and daughter, were found with other victims among the Gilgo Four. So how do you account for those hairs being there, those female hairs? And then once again, female hairs play a role in these two new indictments. I should say in the Sandra Castilla indictment, because there was a woman living in his household in the early 90s.
Was that his first wife?
I can only
Eileen
assume.
Ryan?
They're not stating that.
Okay.
That's only an assumption.
Oh, that's right. I read the document. Yes, they wouldn't identify it.
She had moved out
Yes.
shortly before Sandra Castilla was murdered.
Yes.
But two female hairs from this partner that lived with him in the house in the early 90s, two female hairs are attached to Sandra Castilla, and one of his hairs, according to DNA evidence. So, we have the Gilgo Four, and then we have Sandra Castilla, and his hair, or a female relative's hair, is involved. That's pretty strong.
Yeah, very strong, yeah. I find that evidence, and obviously the cell phone evidence, is really what's going to kind of put the nail in his coffin. But, we'll see. Time will tell. I mean, obviously he's innocent until proven guilty, and it's going to go to court at some point. I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, there's just so much information here. Here we are a little over a year later, and not even close to it going to trial. From what I've heard, it'll probably won't go to trial until sometime late fall next year. What you're thinking of that?
Really a long time.
Yeah.
When this first happened, and when the discovery material was first going out to the defense, originally I heard early 2025, but definitely this whole year was a gone year. They weren't, and that's not unusual. The DA pointed out to me there have been other big serial killer cases where it took 2 to 3 years to go to trial. So it's just a year now since he was arrested. Now that you've added 2 other victims, and you have 6.
Yes.
So that could just make things happen later.
Yes.
It's going to be curious to see is if they go with these 6, because they have the hair evidence, very strong DNA evidence. Will they go with these 6 and just keep trying to find scientific evidence or something else that can attach him to the other unsolved cases? That's going to be the mystery that we're all trying to find out.
I'm also curious to know if at some point he may take a plea deal. I know that his attorney, Michael J. Brown, had said that no, he's not going to take a plea deal. But with all this information coming out and more victims being tied to him, I'm just curious if you think that might be a possibility.
Well, I don't even know what the plea deal would be.
True.
I don't think they're going to give a sweetheart deal for
No.
something like. But however, like if you accept the premise, what the prosecution says, that he's a sadist and that it was about terrorizing people and tormenting them, you know, he could be reliving this all over again and enjoying it if indeed
know.
he's the person who did this.
Oh God.
So, you know, I know that the prosecution and I know the police would like it not to have to go to trial because you know, being victims through things, their families,
Oh sure.
and it costs a lot of money and time to present a case like this. But who knows what his motivation is? But you know, there have been other serial killer cases that I've covered where the person did plead guilty. I didn't quite cover the Son of Sam case. I lived through it as a teenager in the 70s. But within about 6 to 8 months of his arrest, he did plead guilty to the 6 murders. So there was no trial.
Yes.
There were just a couple of chaotic court appearances, but so he pleaded guilty. And so did, who was it? I think Joel Rifkin
Yes.
ended up pleading guilty. So some of them do plead and just get it over with. You know, and then there was that article about allegedly one of the serial killers based out west had established communication with Rex Heuermann and was encouraging him to
Oh
confess.
yes.
I don't have that verified, but
Yes. I
kind
don't
of
know if that
lawyer.
was the happy face killer, I believe.
yes, I think it was,
Yes.
yes, something
Yeah,
like that.
it's sickening. I know. I really wish, you know, obviously the media focuses on the serial killer, but I really wish, you know, the focus would be more on the victims and the victims' families because they're the ones that are, you know, suffering here. And it's just an awful tragedy. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Asa Ellerup. I know there's been a lot of talk about her. My understanding is that she hooked up with a streaming service and is doing a documentary now and is making a lot of money. And, you know, when I talk to people, people are very split on it. There are those that feel that they are also victims in all of this and that she had no idea what her husband was doing. And now, you know, she's